Welcome to Daily Wisdom, Walking the Path with the Buddha, a podcast shared by David Roylance. This podcast is dedicated to guiding you to completely eliminate the discontent mind and the suffering it causes by attaining enlightenment. Learn and practice the teachings of Gotama Buddha that will guide you to fully attain a peaceful, calm, serene, and content mind with joy. To support this podcast, visit patreon.com/support Buddha or visit buddhadailywisdom.com, where you will discover a full range of courses, retreats, and online learning resources to assist you on the path to enlightenment. Now, here's our teacher to share more.
Sawadee Kap. Hello and welcome to Daily Wisdom, Walking the Path with the Buddha. Today is our Pali Canon and English study group, and we're studying the words of the Buddha in Volume 12, which is titled Lowly Arts. We're going to be studying chapters 31 through 40 today. This is a continuation of our previous classes, where now we're going to move into these next 10 chapters. The way that we do this particular program is I open up to any volunteers that might be interested in reading a particular chapter from the book. Those of you guys in Zoom, you're welcome to volunteer to read any chapters. Then after either somebody who reads the chapter or I'll read the chapter, then I'll share some teachings on that. Then I'll open up to any and all questions that you have related to the teachings of the Buddha for that particular chapter. You can ask questions by putting that into Facebook, YouTube, or Zoom in the comment section, and I'll be able to see that. Or you can raise your hand electronically in Zoom and ask any questions that you like. So welcome to all of you, whether you're joining for the first time or you're joining regularly. These teachings of the Buddha, his words, is what's going to actually help you to get to the enlightened mental state. You wouldn't actually be able to get to enlightenment without studying the true teachings of the Buddha, the actual words of the Buddha, because that's where you're going to learn what is the cause of discontentedness and how to eliminate it from the mind through the various tools and techniques that he shares. So this first chapter, this one is titled Those Who Cause the Good Teachings to Disappear, Second Discourse. This is a continuation of the chapters that we read last week, where you were also learning something very similar, but now we're in the second discourse rather than the first one. So here, the words of the Buddha are, monks, those monks who explain the meaning in the teachings by means of badly acquired discourses whose phrasing is an approximation of the correct phrasing, are acting for the harm of many people, for the unhappiness of many people, for the ruin, harm, and suffering of many people, of heavenly beings and human beings. These monks generate much unwholesome Gama and cause the good teachings to disappear. So here what the Buddha is doing is he's foreshadowing the decline of his teachings. He talks about it in other discourses about how his teachings are going to decline over time. But here he's explaining why that actually occurs, because remember, the teachings of the Buddha, he's explaining the natural law of Gama, of cause and effect, or action and result. He's helping you to be able to see what are certain wise decisions that lead to wholesome results or wholesome Gama, and certain unwise decisions that lead to unwholesome results or unwholesome Gama. Here he's explaining why his teachings would slowly deteriorate over time and what causes that to occur, so that then his students would be able to do just the opposite in order to maintain his teachings as long as possible in the world. So what he's sharing is that when people are explaining his teachings with badly acquired words and phrasing, approximations, they're not actually using the correct phrasing, that they're acting on the harm or for the harm and unhappiness of many people, because they're not able to learn the teachings that are going to actually lead to enlightenment and get to this enlightened mental state where the mind's peaceful, calm, serene, and content with joy. So anybody who's choosing to share these teachings, they should either be enlightened or very close to enlightenment, so that they fully understand the wisdom that it takes to be able to guide others to enlightenment. And then when you're teaching, you would like to choose wisely certain phrases and words that you're going to be using in order to explain the teaching, so the students can have a very straightforward time of learning and understanding, digesting that content, being able to investigate the teachings, reflect on them to independently verify and practice them. Because getting to enlightenment, while it's not very difficult, it's also not easy either. It takes time and effort and energy and the ability to study, and a teacher speaking in a way that is very straightforward with well acquired words and phrases that explain the teachings. This makes it easier and easier for people to understand. Sometimes if an individual is not yet enlightened and they have ego in their mind, they might explain the teachings in a very complicated way with all kinds of complicated words and phrasings just to be able to sound like you're smart or you're intelligent or something like this. But a really wise individual who's sharing these teachings and knows the challenges involved in getting to enlightenment, they wouldn't make the teachings more difficult to understand with very complicated language. Instead, understanding that English is a international language, not everybody speaks English as a native person, you would attempt to make the teachings as simple and straightforward as possible, because by making them as simple and straightforward as possible, the widest audience possible can learn and understand those teachings and practice and experience the results. So anybody who's sharing these teachings, you got to watch your own ego that it's not in there trying to get you to use all kinds of complicated language, because that just makes it more difficult for people to learn and understand these teachings. We would like to share these teachings in a way that makes them available to the widest audience possible, keeping in mind that now that we're teaching in the English language, not everybody's a native English speaker. And even native English speakers sometimes have challenges with certain words. So the more simple, the more common language that you can use, the more widely that the teachings can be shared in the world. So by doing so, you're actually functioning for the welfare of many people. And even though I haven't read this chapter yet, I'm going to move on to chapter 32, because this is just the opposite of what I was just sharing in chapter 31 and what the Buddha was teaching. I'll read this one for you, and then I'll open up to any questions that you guys have about both individual chapters. This one is titled Those Who Sustain the Good Teachings, Second Discourse. Now, this is the Buddha explaining how to ensure that his teachings continue for a long period and they help as many people as possible. Monks, those monks who explain the meaning in the teachings with well-acquired discourses, whose phrasing is not mere approximation, are acting for the welfare of many people, for the peacefulness of many people, for the good, welfare, and peacefulness of many people, of heavenly beings and humans. These monks generate much merit and sustain the good teachings. So this is what you would like to do, is you would like to deeply understand vocabulary and language. Prior to me ever sharing these teachings, I needed to do a lot of research on the vocabulary of certain words, because oftentimes we use words in a way that they're not really intended to be used, and maybe in a certain group of people or within your family you use the words this way. But when you start sharing teachings very far and very wide, you would like to be sure that you develop an understanding of various words and vocabulary in a way that the widest audience possible is going to understand. And that means that you're going to need to dig in and develop your wisdom, not only as a teacher, but to get to enlightenment too, because as these teachings are being shared in a certain language, you're going to need to investigate. Like one of the first words I remember that I really needed to investigate was the word heedless. When the Buddha was teaching to eliminate substances that cause heedlessness, well, I didn't know what heedlessness was. I needed to go research that and figure that out. And I figured out that it was unattentiveness, unalertness, unawareness, unmindfulness, right? And when you understand this, then you can apply the teaching to any and all substances that are in existence in the world. And this is a timeless teaching, because the Buddha wouldn't have been able to name all the different substances that would come about in the future. So he needed to speak in a way that was timeless. So by using the word heedless, it can apply over time, no matter his lifetime, 2,500 years ago, now, or 10,000 years into the future. This word heedlessness can represent any substance. So this is why the Buddha spoke in the way that he did. He was very careful and very attentive to the language that he spoke in. In the translations that I use, the way that I share the teachings, I'm very careful to look at the words and the phrasing, because this way it'll make it as easy as possible for people to understand, so that they can then reflect on those teachings and then practice them and experience the results. So let me know if you guys have any questions on chapter 31 or 32. This is helping you to understand how the teachings are gradually declining and why that's occurring, the cause and effect. And then this particular chapter 32 is explaining how to sustain the good teachings for the good, welfare, and peacefulness of many people as well as heavenly beings. Okay, I'm not seeing any questions anywhere. So I'm just going to move on to the next chapter then, which is chapter 33. This one is titled 10 Roots of Disputes. Here, one of his students starts out. Venerable Sir, why is it that arguments, conflict, contention, and disputes arise in the community, and monks do not reside at ease? Here, student. 1. Monks explain non-teachings as teachings. 2. In teachings as non-teachings. 3. They explain non-discipline as discipline. And 4. Discipline as non-discipline. 5. They explain what has not been stated and spoken by the Tathagata as having been stated and spoken by him. And 6. What has been stated and spoken by the Tathagata as not having been stated and spoken by him. 7. They explain what has not been practiced by the Tathagata as having been practiced by him. And 8. What has been practiced by the Tathagata as not having been practiced by him. 9. They explain what has not been prescribed by the Tathagata as having been prescribed by him. In 10. What has been prescribed by the Tathagata as having not been prescribed by him. This, student, is why arguments, conflict, contention, and disputes arise in the community, and monks do not reside at ease. Venerable Sir, how many roots of disputes are there? There are, student, 10 roots of dispute. What 10? Here. Monks explain non-teachings as teachings, and teachings as non-teachings. They explain non-discipline as discipline, and discipline as non-discipline. They explain what has not been stated and spoken by the Tathagata as having been stated and spoken by him, and what has been stated and spoken by the Tathagata as having not been stated and spoken by him. They explain what has not been practiced by the Tathagata as having been practiced by him, and what has been practiced by the Tathagata as not having been practiced by him. They explain what has not been prescribed by the Tathagata as having been prescribed by him, and what has been prescribed by the Tathagata as having not been prescribed by him. These, students, are the 10 roots of disputes. So here the Buddha is explaining why there's ordained practitioners within his community that are arguing or having conflicts and contention and disputes. Because during the lifetime of the Buddha, all his teachings were oral, and if you were with the Buddha and you heard what he said, you then every 2 weeks would recite the teachings in order to commit them to memory. But the unenlightened mind with pollution, it lacks the ability to have deep memory. As you clear out the pollution out of your mind, you have deep memory and understanding and being able to remember things for a long-term period. But in the process of getting to enlightenment, you're going to have these pollutions, which makes it challenging to remember the teachings. But through repetition and studying diligently, you can ultimately come to an understanding and actually remember things. And also in the unenlightened state, you will argue and you'll have conflict and contention. But by the time you get to enlightenment, you won't argue. But here, what the Buddha is explaining is this cause and effect, or action and result. Why is it that people have these difficulties in a community? Is that they're not understanding his teachings and they're not practicing his teachings closely. Because here he's giving these 10 roots of disputes that people explain non-teachings as his teachings, meaning they're not actually sharing his true teachings. And the teachings that he shared, they're explaining them as non-teachings. And this produces arguments and conflict and contention. During the lifetime of the Buddha, and even now, this causes contention and arguments and conflict as well, because people don't understand what they don't understand. So it's when you investigate the teachings using the original words of the Buddha that you can then know the truth for yourself, that you don't believe his teachings. You investigate them, reflect on them to independently verify, and you practice. And then you'll know the truth of what the true teachings are. In a situation where somebody doesn't understand the teachings, It's really not your place to be able to try to convince them of what the teachings are. That would just come from your own craving. If somebody doesn't understand the teachings, it's up to that individual to choose to reach out and get help and get support and get guidance. If you're giving unsolicited guidance, this is really unwise. It's coming from your own craving. It's coming from your own ego. So if an individual is going to get to enlightenment, they're going to need to make 1,000,001 decisions in order to get to enlightenment. And if their ego is so high that they're not willing to actually get help, then this is going to cause difficulties for them. But if you were to try to convince them of what the teachings are and you're trying to force them or control them to learn the teachings, this is your own craving and your ego, and you're not going to be able to get to enlightenment that way. So focus on your own development, your own training, reach out for guidance when you need help, and be sure that you're paying close attention to what the true teachings are through not believing the teachings. Even in the books, even as I'm teaching them to you, you learn them, reflect on them, and practice them. And this is what cuts through all this impermanence. Because during the lifetime of the Buddha, as an oral tradition, it's very easy for impermanence to make its way in. It's very easy for teachings to be changed because people didn't necessarily remember. They didn't hear the same things when they were sitting with the Buddha. But even now, 2,500 years later, all the various books and resources that you see in the world, it's very easy for them to be affected by impermanence. And you would like to be sure that whatever you're studying is the true teachings. And the way that you cut through all that 2,500 years of impermanence is by not believing in the teachings at all. Don't believe the books, don't believe what I say, don't believe what anybody says about the teachings of the Buddha. But by you learning, investigating, and examining, by reflecting to independently verify and practice, this is what will bring you to the wisdom to know with 100% certainty what the true teachings are. And where you're having difficulties independently verifying and seeing clearly anything that I'm teaching to you, that's where you ask questions. Whether it's in a book, whether it's in a class that I teach, or any of the resources that I share, if you're having difficulties understanding how to independently verify something, ask questions, and then I will help you to be able to understand that. So these are the 10 roots of disputes. But they don't need to be disputes, is what I'm sharing, is that you can choose not to argue. If somebody's not understanding the teachings, so be it. That's on them. If you understand the teachings, be confident in that understanding, be confident in that wisdom, and don't feel like you need to pressure or force or control or convince anybody to understand any aspect of these teachings. Each individual person is responsible for their own growth and development on the path to enlightenment. So let me know what questions you guys have here. Remember, you can put that into Facebook, YouTube, or Zoom, or you can raise your hand in Zoom and ask any questions that you like. Looks like Mayu Lee has a question here on Facebook. Teacher, when we share the words of the Buddha, when we don't remember the exact words, but we know the understanding, we know and understand the meaning, how can we share that without harming the teachings? What would be best is to go to the resources and actually see the resources themselves. So if there's a certain discourse that you're sharing with your mom, I think that's probably what you're talking about, or some friend or family member, just go pull up the book. Get really familiar with the teachings of the Buddha, pull that up, and then actually just use those words. And then over time, you'll get more and more used to what the Buddha taught. If you understand the meaning and you truly can communicate it, but you're using slightly different words, that's okay, as long as it's truly the meaning. But you need to be 100% sure that what you're communicating is truly the meaning. And where you're not sure, have the resources there right next to you so you can consult with it. And it will help the individual who's choosing to learn. It'll give them confidence to see that, okay, here's what the Buddha taught, and then here's what you're saying the Buddha taught, and I can see the comparison there. So that's why, like in that first book, volume 1, I share the words of the Buddha at the beginning of a chapter, for example, and then I teach it, and then I share it with my words so you can see and build confidence that, yes, what David's teaching is what the Buddha taught. And that's what I'm doing here too in this particular program and in these books. So you can replicate that in your home environment or with your mom or your other family members or friends who are asking for help, is that you can share the teachings and then have the books right there so that they can consult, whether it's an electronic version or a printed version, and they can build a confidence in the teachings of the Buddha and not just in your words, because the words of the Buddha have a lot more weight behind them. They have a lot more significance behind them. And if they can see more and more readily that what you're sharing is matching to what the Buddha is sharing, people will build confidence not only in the Buddha, but in you as well. And you'll be much more effective at sharing the teachings. Great question there, Mayu Lee. All right, so I'm not seeing any other questions anywhere. So we'll move on to chapter 34. This one is titled, Disciples Who Behave Towards the Teacher with Hostility and with Friendliness. And how do disciples behave towards the teacher with hostility, not with friendliness? Here, Ananda, compassionate in seeking their welfare. The teacher teaches the teachings to the disciples out of compassion. This is for your welfare. This is for your peacefulness. His disciples do not want to hear or give ear or apply effort with their minds to understand. They stray and turn away from the teacher's teachings. Thus, do disciples behave towards the teacher with hostility, not with friendliness? And how do disciples behave towards the teacher with friendliness, not with hostility? Here, Ananda, compassionate in seeking their welfare. The teacher teaches the teachings to the disciples out of compassion. This is for your welfare. This is for your peacefulness. His disciples are interested to hear and give ear and apply effort with their minds to understand. They do not stray and turn away from the teacher's teachings. Thus do disciples behave towards the teacher with friendliness, not with hostility. Therefore, Ananda, behave towards me with friendliness, not with hostility. That will lead to your welfare and peacefulness for a long time. I shall not treat you as the potter treats the raw damp clay, repeatedly restraining you. I shall speak to you, Ananda, repeatedly guiding you of what to avoid. I shall speak to you, Ananda. The truly dedicated will stand the test. So this is actually a really deep teaching, in my opinion, but I will break it down for you, help you understand this. This is so important because what this is talking about is the teacher-student relationship. It's so important to have a healthy teacher-student relationship in order to get to enlightenment. Without that healthy student-teacher relationship, you would be lost without any kind of ability to get to enlightenment, because it's only a Buddha that would be able to get to enlightenment by themselves. Everybody else is going to need teachers, and a Buddha in the world is very rare. So you're going to need to have teachers, and oftentimes your Buddhist teacher is one of the very first healthy relationships that you really have, where you learn how to practice love without attachment, unconditional love. You should be experiencing that from your teacher. You learn how to be respectful and polite and kind and friendly, because you should be seeing that modeled in your teacher's conduct and behavior. But what the Buddha is talking about here with Ananda, one of his very close students, is saying, hey, if you don't listen to the teachings and you don't pay attention to them and you're not applying effort to learn them, this is like having hostility towards your teacher. But if you're listening to the teachings and you're learning the teachings and you're applying effort to understand them, this is practicing friendliness towards your teacher. Because remember, a teacher who's sharing these teachings, they don't want anything or expect anything from their students. At least they shouldn't, if they're teaching them in the way that the Buddha taught them, and if they're either enlightened or very close to enlightenment. They shouldn't want anything or expect anything from their students whatsoever. They should just be giving, and helping their students. That's what the Buddha is saying, is that out of compassion, seeking the welfare of their students. The compassion is the concern for the misfortune of others. Seeking welfare is to see that you're doing well and that you're taken care of. So a teacher sharing the teachings, they're not doing it for their benefit, right? A teacher who's sharing the teachings of the Buddha, they're most likely living off of donations, which is very minimal compared to what they could make if they were in private business or if they were employees somewhere. They can make a whole lot more money doing those kinds of things. So anybody who's sharing these teachings, it wouldn't be about money, it wouldn't be about fame or fortune or any of those kinds of things. It's only purely to help their students. And if you're coming in contact with somebody like that, then if you were to listen to their teachings and learn them and grow and develop, this is showing friendliness, because the time, effort, and energy and resources that a teacher is using to share their teachings, it's actually being beneficial to you. And you're taking that in and you're actually benefiting from learning and developing on the path. But if you weren't paying attention to the teachings and you could care less, this is being disrespectful and having hostility towards the teacher. The Buddha has another discourse where he talks at different times about this relationship with the teacher. He talks about one of the most respectful things that you could ever do for him, to respect him as a teacher, is to learn and practice his teachings. That's the best way to respect him. Like, people might think coming to a Buddha or coming to a teacher and bowing down and giving them gifts and admiring them, you might think that that's what would be the way to respect a Buddha. That's not the way that a Buddha is interested in anybody respecting them. The way that you respect a Buddha or any teacher who's sharing the teachings is learn and practice their teachings, get to enlightenment. And that shows that you're really taking this teachings to heart, and you're learning and growing and developing, and the time, effort, energy, and resources that a teacher is sharing is being beneficial for you. So this is the way that you can live with respect towards a teacher, because in this student-teacher relationship, a teacher shouldn't want anything from you or expect anything from you. It's only there to benefit you. If you were hostile and disrespectful to a teacher, you should expect that they're no longer going to teach you, right? This is your Gotama coming to you. Even a teacher who lives with compassion and loving kindness for their students, if you were repeatedly disrespectful over and over and over again, your Gotama, the results of your decisions, is that person's not going to teach you anymore. And that's a way to help you to learn the natural law of Gotama. So you would like to forge a very healthy relationship with your teacher where there's this respect and gratitude and appreciation. But also you should see those same qualities being practiced from the teacher to you, right? That the teacher should have appreciation, gratitude, and respect towards you as well. This is the mutual support that a student-teacher relationship has. That by a teacher sharing the teachings with the students, this is what they need in order to get to enlightenment. This is like air itself. This is like blood itself coursing through your veins to be able to sustain your life. That's how important the teachings are to come into your life, to be able to then make improvements in your life and get closer and closer to enlightenment. So having that lifeline to your teacher and having a healthy relationship so that the teachings continue to flow to you is vitally important. But also the way that a teacher is teaching their students is they're also teaching not only through their words, but through their actions. So this is why it's so important that a teacher is also kind and loving and respectful and friendly towards their students as well, so that that is what comes back to the teacher. And now there's this mutual support that by the teacher sharing the teachings, this lifeblood for the students, now the students would be willing to practice some generosity with their teacher so that their teacher can have the support that they need to sustain their life, to purchase food, water, clothing, shelter, and medical care. And in this way, there's this mutual support. And a teacher who's practicing in this way and a student who's practicing in this way, they can have a very healthy relationship. And the teachings can be shared for a very long period of time and can benefit many, many, many people. The Buddha has another discourse that he talks about where this relationship between the students and the teacher should be like a newly arrived bride. If you think about a newly arrived bride, meaning this bride marries a particular person, they move into the home of their in-laws, and now maybe for the first 30 days or so, they're doing everything very, very well, right? Because they're new to this household. Maybe they're attending to their in-laws. Maybe they're bringing them food. Maybe they're taking out the trash. Maybe they're washing dishes and cooking and cleaning and doing various things around the house to treat the in-laws very well because they're new to the home and they're trying to fit in. Well, after a newly arrived bride has kind of gone through the honeymoon phase, maybe like 6 weeks, 8 weeks, 12 weeks into their stay, maybe they kind of slack off. They become complacent. Maybe they start being disgruntled with their in-laws. They don't like the way they do things. Maybe they don't help out around the house as much anymore. And this is going to promote an unhealthy relationship. But what the Buddha shares is that you should treat your teacher as if you are a newly arrived bride, and always do that. Don't allow complacency to set in, where you can have this appreciation, gratitude, and respect towards your teacher. And then again, the teacher should be practicing the same way as well. And then the Buddha sums this up towards the end where he's talking to Ananda and he says, I'm not going to treat you like a potter treats the raw damp clay. repeatedly restraining you, because raw damn clay, you have to constantly mold it and mold it and mold it. And the Buddha is saying, hey, I'm not going to do that to you. I'm not going to constantly restrain you, because that's your job as a student, to restrain your own mind. It's not up to the teacher to restrain a student. Instead, what a teacher will do is, I shall speak to you, Ananda. Meaning, I will guide you, I will teach you, I will talk to you. I'm not going to constantly restrain you. That's your job. You're an adult. You need to learn and have the wisdom. It's not up to the teacher to constantly restrain their students, but instead to speak and guide and help the student along. What the Buddha says here is repeatedly guiding you of what to avoid. I shall speak to you, Ananda. So he's going to explain to him the natural law of karma. This is what he's saying is, hey, I'm not going to restrain you. I'm not going to hold you back, but I'm going to give you the wisdom that you can cultivate to hold yourself back and restrain yourself from these evils that you could potentially conduct. And then he says, the truly dedicated will stand the test, because it's a real challenge to get to enlightenment. It's not easy, but it's not difficult either. So the truly dedicated, those who have dedication, determination, and diligence, they will work their way through all the different pollutions of the mind, and they will get to enlightenment. But if they don't have dedication and determination to diligently study and be dedicated in their practice to be meditating and learning the teachings, they're not going to be able to get to enlightenment. So that's why he says the truly dedicated will stand the test. They will actually get to enlightenment. So let me know what questions you guys have here on this particular chapter. I think it's really helpful for any students that are studying the teachings of the Buddha, but also this is really helpful for you in any environment where you're in a student-teacher relationship. As a teacher, it can help you, but also as a student. If you're studying English or Spanish, or you're studying to be an electrical engineer or mathematics, or you're studying to be a lawyer, treating your teacher with respect, even if you're paying tuition to go to a college, by you having respect towards your teacher, this is going to promote the teacher's interest to share teachings and help you with wisdom. And here in Thailand, they understand that teachers are vitally important, and they really respect teachers because they know that with teachers, they're sharing wisdom, and wisdom in a community is going to help that community of people become stronger and stronger and stronger and function better in the world. But if we disrespect our teachers in any kind of population, there's going to be less and less teachers who are interested in actually teaching. And you'll see this in a community, that the more disrespect from the students to the teachers, the less and less teachers are interested in teaching. And then the wisdom of that community and the population goes down and down and down and down, and it becomes much more difficult for people to live life. So by having respect towards teachers, not only do you experience more and more wisdom, but then there's more and more teachers that are willing to share teachings, not just the teachings of the Buddha, because we need other teachers as well. We need to learn about electrical engineering and how to be a lawyer and how to be a construction worker and an electrician and a taxi driver. We need people to teach all different types of topics. This is what helps a population of people become stronger and stronger as they're becoming wiser and wiser. So you can see this cause and effect, that disrespect leads to less wisdom being shared in the community because less teachers are teaching. Respect for wisdom and for teachers results in more and more wisdom being shared in the community. So let me see if you guys have any questions here on this particular chapter. Okay, I'm not seeing any questions anywhere. So I'll move on to the next chapter. This is chapter 35. Here, this one's titled Difference Between the Perfectly Enlightened One and a Monk Liberated by Wisdom. What the Buddha is going to teach you here is what's the difference between a Buddha, a perfectly enlightened one, and just an individual who gets to enlightenment. He's going to show you the difference here. The Tathagata monks, the Arahant, the perfectly enlightened one, is the originator of the path, unarisen before, the producer of the path, unproduced before, the declarer of the path, undeclared before. He is the knower of the path, the discoverer of the path, the one skilled in the path. And his disciples now reside practicing that path and become possessed of it afterwards. This, monks, is the distinction, the disparity, the difference between the Tathagata, the Arahant, the perfectly enlightened one, and a monk liberated by wisdom. Okay, so what a Tathagata is, and what this word means, is one who's discovered the truth, or one who shares the truth. This is a Buddha. So the Buddha himself would often refer to himself as the Tathagata. He occasionally referred to himself as a Buddha so that other people knew what a Buddha is, and now we know that. But during his lifetime, he most readily referred to himself as the Tathagata, because it's actually good for people to not know that he's an actual Buddha. Because if everybody knew who a Buddha was, they would be on their best behavior when they were around a Buddha. And now the one power that is the most strongest with a Buddha is the ability to read other people's minds and be able to see the pollutions of their mind, and then be able to offer teachings that can actually help them in any given situation. So if everybody was on their best behavior around a Buddha and everybody knew who a Buddha was, then that power would be rendered useless. So there's not like a certain turn of the ear or turn of the nose that distinguishes who a Buddha is. A Buddha is not interested in everybody knowing that they're a Buddha. Particularly nowadays, they would be more interested in just sharing their teachings and using this power of being able to observe their students' mind in the natural state to then be able to offer them teachings that would be helpful for them. So what a Buddha is they are the originator of the path, unarisen before, producer of the path, unproduced before, declarer of the path, knower of the path, discoverer of the path. They're skilled in the path. They actually get to enlightenment by themselves without the help of any teachers or any guides. That's the first criteria of what makes a Buddha, is that they get to enlightenment without the help of any teachers or any guides. The second criteria is that they dedicate the rest of their life to sharing their independently discovered teachings for the rest of their life. From the time they get to enlightenment until they die, they're going to be sharing their teachings. And they're going to share those with countless people. And countless people are going to get to enlightenment during the lifetime of that person, because that person has deep wisdom about the path to enlightenment. Then the third criteria is that they're going to preserve their teachings in such a way that after their death, countless more people are going to get to enlightenment. So these are the three criteria, is that they get to enlightenment by themselves, they dedicate the rest of their life to sharing their teachings and countless people get to enlightenment, and then they preserve their teachings so that countless more people get to enlightenment after their death. So this is what a Buddha is, and they're very rare in the world. The last one that the world is currently aware of existed over 2,500 years ago. A person who gets to enlightenment that is not a Buddha, which is essentially everyone else in the world, this individual has still gotten to enlightenment, which is wonderful. Getting to enlightenment is absolutely wonderful. Whether you're a Buddha or not, it's still wonderful to get to enlightenment. And now the way that that occurs is through learning with a teacher. And you get to enlightenment through wisdom that you need to learn. You need to investigate those teachings, reflect on them to independently verify and practice them. And that's what's going to lead to your enlightenment. So everyone else in the world has the ability to get to enlightenment as an enlightened being, but they wouldn't be a Buddha at that point. Nowadays, you see some people in the world that says everybody is a Buddha, or you have Buddha nature. But this isn't what the Buddha actually taught. The Buddha taught that it's very rare for a Buddha to exist in the world. So there's no need for you to think about that you are a Buddha, because there's a certain quality in the mind of an individual who's going to become a Buddha that the average person doesn't have. What the quality is that a Buddha has that is very different than every other being is that every other being has a certain capacity in their mind. It's like a hard drive, maybe 500 gigabytes or 1,000 or a terabyte or something like this. You have a certain limited capacity. And then as you experience new things, you have to delete old files in order to store new files. This is why you only have spotty memories about your past. When you think back to your childhood, you just have spotty memories because you've had to delete those files in order to store new files. So the last 5 years or so, you kind of remember generally what it is that you've been involved in. But if you go back too far, you just have spotty memories there. So this is because you have a limited capacity. You only have a certain amount of hard drive space. But a person who's going to become a Buddha, they have an unlimited capacity to understand and remember things from their current life and their previous lives as well. So they remember countless details about their childhood and growing up. They remember countless details about their past lives, and they bring forth all this wisdom in their last life in order to apply it and actually get to enlightenment by themselves. So a Buddha, person who becomes a Buddha, they're considered to be perfectly enlightened because they didn't have any teachers or any guides, and anything that they're actually using in order to get to enlightenment, they know that that's actually what leads to enlightenment. If they tried a certain meditation and it didn't lead to their enlightenment, they just set it aside. They know that that's not part of the path. By the time a Buddha gets to enlightenment, what they know and understand is the path to enlightenment. And then they spend the rest of their life illuminating that path, making it as clear as possible for everybody else to understand what it takes to get to enlightenment. And by keeping those words of a Buddha very clear and very concise and using accurate words and phrases, then more and more people can actually get to enlightenment. So a Buddha, if they do a certain meditation and it doesn't work, they'll discard it. So by the time they get to enlightenment, they have deep, profound wisdom. But a individual who gets to enlightenment as an enlightened being, maybe 70, 80, 90% of what they've learned actually led to their enlightenment, but they might still have a little bit of extra things floating around that they're doing that didn't actually lead to their enlightenment. Like a certain meditation or a certain practice that didn't actually lead to their enlightenment, but they're still practicing it anyway. Maybe 10, 20, 30% of what they're actually practicing. Because they have teachers, they might still kind of learn something from a particular teacher, and they might think that, oh, this is what I need to do, and they might not have fully investigated to determine whether or not that thing is actually helping them or not. So an average enlightened being is still going to have a few things that they're doing that isn't actually the path to enlightenment. So that's why they're not perfectly enlightened. But they've gotten to enlightenment, and that's wonderful. But a Buddha is going to be perfectly enlightened. This word arahant is a word that was used during the lifetime of the Buddha to describe an individual who's purified their mind. So a Buddha is an arahant. They've purified their mind. They've eliminated all the 10 fetters. An enlightened being is also an arahant, an average enlightened being. They're also an arahant. They've eliminated the 10 fetters. They've purified their mind. But the way that this occurs for a Buddha is that they have no teachers and no guides. And the way that it occurs for everyone else is they're going to need teachers and guides. And this is what the Buddha is describing here. So let me know if you guys have any questions on this. You can put that into Facebook, YouTube, or Zoom, or you can raise your hand in Zoom and ask any questions that you like. Mayuli is asking a question here in Facebook. Teacher, if the Buddha is the originator of the path, unarisen before, would the new Buddha be considered as a Buddha as well, since the teachings have been arisen? So a Buddha is going to get to enlightenment without the help of any teachers or any guides, right? So that's the first criteria. So a new Buddha would need to get to enlightenment without the help of any teachers or any guides. They would have needed to rediscover the path. It's the Buddha who discovers the path. The first Buddha, right? Gotama Buddha. He was the discoverer, the declarer, the originator of the path. But that path has disappeared. So any new Buddha coming into the world, they're going to need to rediscover this path and be able to share it. Because while the natural laws of existence are the same, there's certain things that are just maybe slightly revised for this new time frame, this 2,500 years later, right? There's certain things that the Buddha taught that absolutely led to enlightenment during that time frame, and they would lead to enlightenment now too. But there's a certain bit of revision. It's the same natural laws, but there's going to be new analogies, there's going to be new descriptions, there's going to be some slight differences in terms of what it would be communicated as in order to get to enlightenment. But the core teachings, they're all the same. It's the natural laws of existence, but they're being articulated in a way from this new Buddha that they have rediscovered them. And now they're sharing them into the world in such a way that countless people could get to enlightenment, and they could be preserved after their death in a way that countless more people could get to enlightenment. So a new Buddha would be considered a Buddha if they've gotten to enlightenment by themselves, if they dedicate the rest of their life to sharing their independently discovered teachings, and countless people would get to enlightenment during that person's lifetime, and then they preserve their teachings so that countless more people can get to enlightenment after their death. And remember, any Buddha that is in the world, they're not going to be interested in going around and declaring to other people that they're a Buddha, because it's much more potent for them to be able to share their teachings when people don't actually know that they're an actual Buddha. Okay, I'm not seeing any other questions anywhere. So I'm going to move on to the next chapter here, which is chapter 36. This one is titled, "The Tathagata Taught Very Few Compared to the Numerous Things He Had Known." On one occasion, the perfectly enlightened one was residing at Kosambi in a Simsapa grove. Then the perfectly enlightened one took up a few Simsapa leaves in his hand and addressed the monks thus: "What do you think, monks, which is more numerous, these few Simsapa leaves that I have taken up in my hand, or those in the Simsapa grove overhead?" "Venerable Sir, the Simsapa leaves that the perfectly enlightened one has taken up in his hand are few, but those in the Simsapa grove overhead are numerous. So too, monks, the things I have directly known but have not taught you are numerous, while the things I have taught you are few. And why, monks, have I not taught you those many things? Because they are unbeneficial, irrelevant to the fundamentals of the holy life, and do not lead to fading away of strong feelings, to the freedom from strong feelings, to elimination, to peace, to direct knowledge, experience, to enlightenment, to nibbana. Therefore, I have not taught them. And what, monks, have I taught? I have taught, this is discontentedness. I have taught, this is the cause of discontentedness. I have taught, this is the elimination of discontentedness. I have taught, this is the way leading to the elimination of discontentedness. And why, monks, have I taught this? Because this is beneficial, relevant to the fundamentals of the holy life, and leads to fading away of strong feelings, to freedom from strong feelings, to elimination, to peace, to direct knowledge, experience, to enlightenment, to nibbana. Therefore, I have taught this." Okay, so what the Buddha is describing here is a way to explain that he knows countless things about the world, but he only taught very few of those things. He just taught the limited things that you need in order to get to enlightenment. And this is a way to help students understand without him having ego. Instead of saying, gosh, I know so many things, I'm not going to teach you guys all those things because, you guys can't handle that. I'm just going to teach you these things over here. He's doing it in a very respectful, very polite way of saying, hey, there's all this wisdom out there that I've learned and that I understand, but I'm only going to teach you the things that lead to your enlightenment, these few things that lead to your enlightenment. And while those few things are quite extensive, as you're learning the path to enlightenment, you're like, oh my goodness, the Buddha knew all these kinds of things. Wow, he was really wise. Just imagine he understood so much more. So all the leaves overhead, those represent all the things that he ever knew. But the few leaves that he picked up in his hand, that represented what it takes to get to enlightenment. And that's why he taught it, because that's what leads to enlightenment. And when he says, what did he teach? He points to the Four Noble Truths. When he says, and what have I taught? I've taught the Four Noble Truths is essentially what he's saying. He's pointing to the Four Noble Truths. And then he says, why have I taught this? Because this is what leads to enlightenment. When you understand the problem in the unenlightened mind is discontentedness, the cause of that problem is craving, desire, attachment, the longing, yearning. The elimination of discontentedness is to eliminate craving, desire, attachment. The way leading to the elimination of discontentedness is the Eightfold Path. When you can break through to understanding the Four Noble Truths and establish right view, now you can actually get to enlightenment. Without establishing right view from the very beginning of your journey to enlightenment, you wouldn't be able to get to enlightenment. So he's taught the Four Noble Truths and what leads to enlightenment, because that's what leads to the fading away of strong feelings. That's what leads to peace and joy of the enlightened mind. But understand that whenever a Buddha is teaching, that they're only going to teach you the few things that it takes to be able to get to enlightenment. And while that's numerous, the things that they actually know about the world is much more numerous. And by the way, going back to that previous discourse that I shared, you guys can ask questions on chapter 36, but going back to this chapter 35, this is where I share that some people say that there were Buddhas before Gotama Buddha. And in the Pali Canon, you will see where the Buddha is quoted as having said that there were Buddhas before him. But this is the one conflict that you will find in the Pali Canon. This is the only conflict that I've ever seen, where here he says that he's the originator of the path, unarisen before, right? That means nobody ever taught it before him. Undeclared before, right? He's the declarer, undeclared before. right? So it was unknown before him. So this is why I say that Gautama Buddha was the only Buddha. He's the first and the only one up until that time frame. And if you understand the complexity of what it takes to get to enlightenment, of course, a Buddha is going to simplify it. But when you understand the detail that you need to communicate at, then you would understand that humanity was evolving slowly over history, that we didn't even have complex language until about the time of the life of the Buddha. That 10,000 years before the Buddha or 30,000 years before the Buddha, we didn't have enough complex language in the human existence to be able to explain the path to enlightenment. So it was only during that time frame that we had evolved as human beings to the point where he could communicate in a language that could be understood by students to be able to get to enlightenment. So here with this discourse and understanding the history of human evolution, I've come to the conclusion that he was the actual first Buddha that existed. Whether he was the first or wasn't, and whether there were other Buddhas before him, it doesn't really matter at this point, because your mind's discontent and you need to learn the teachings in order to train your mind and get to enlightenment. But this is what I point to as evidence that the Buddha was the first Buddha. And you can see based on language as well that even nowadays it's really challenging for students to understand with the English language, as detailed as it can be, that there's lots of clarity that needs to be communicated by a teacher and a student to understand that it's sometimes challenging for students to understand. So the idea of Buddhas existing 30,000 years ago or 50,000 years ago, I can't fathom that, because language hadn't evolved to a point where that was even possible. So if you guys have questions about this chapter 36, where the Buddha is talking about all the numerous things that he had known versus the few things that he taught in order to help people get to enlightenment, let me know. Okay, I'm not seeing any questions anywhere. So let's move to chapter 37. This is another one that talks about a teacher and kind of a teacher's role. It's titled, One Who Points Out Treasure. Ananda, I shall not treat you as the potter treats the raw damp clay, repeatedly restraining you. I shall speak to you, Ananda, repeatedly guiding you of what to avoid. I shall speak to you, Ananda. The truly dedicated will stand the test. Regard him as one who points out treasure, the wise one who, seeing your faults, guides you of what to avoid. Stay with this sort of teacher. For the one who stays with a teacher of this sort, things get better, not worse. Okay, so this first part is what we were talking about earlier, right? Like a teacher's role is not to repeatedly restrain their students, but it's to communicate the teachings, provide the wisdom, and then the students need to investigate that and learn it and then reflect on it to independently verify and practice it. They need to restrain themselves, right? The truly dedicated will do that work and actually experience enlightenment. But what the Buddha is saying here is regard your teacher as one who's seeing your faults, as one who's pointing out treasure. Because the way the unenlightened mind works is it's so polluted and there's ego in there that you don't see the things that are unwise that you're doing. If you could see the things on your own that are unwise, you wouldn't do those things and you would be a Buddha. So having a teacher who understands a bit about your life, who understands your relationships, who maybe you spend time with from time to time, this is really helpful, because that teacher can then point out treasure to you and say, hey, by the way, I noticed you were talking to your husband. You were a bit rough and hostile. This is something that you might decide to look into, right? Or, hey, I noticed that you were over here perhaps lying in your work environment. This is really unwise. So a teacher pointing this out to you is pointing out treasure, because by you now understanding that wisdom, you can train your mind to avoid those things. And now you'll experience improved results based on the natural law of Gotama, of cause and effect. And remember, a teacher is helping you with no benefit to themselves. They're not in it to benefit themselves. Any teacher who's either enlightened or close to it, they're doing this out of compassion for their students. So by them pointing out treasure to you, this is only to benefit you. And what the Buddha is saying is, stay with this sort of teacher, because they're there to benefit you. They're there to help you and point out these things. For one who stays with a teacher of this sort, things get better, not worse. Because if a teacher is helping you to see the treasure, and you're taking heed to that, and you're looking at that, and you're reflecting on that, and you're gaining wisdom, improving your decision making, things get better, not worse, as you learn and practice these teachings. So you would like to have a teacher who points out treasure. But as a teacher, you need to be very careful about this, particularly early on in the student-teacher relationship, because the student doesn't necessarily know that you're there out of compassion and out of loving kindness. And early on in the student-teacher relationship, the student's mind is more polluted. So just going around and admonishing their students would be very unwise, right? To go around and criticize or ridicule their students. It's wise to be gentle and kind and warm and loving, to be able to point out certain challenges that a student might be experiencing. And this will be much better received by the student themselves. So a student would be wise to be with a teacher who's pointing out treasure, but as a teacher, you need to be very wise about how you point out this treasure and ensuring that it's beneficial for the student and that your own ego isn't involved. Because if you're either enlightened or close to it, if you're enlightened, there's no ego there. But if you're close to it, you might still have some ego in there, and you might need to kind of diminish that and eliminate that and extinguish it, because as you're talking with your students, you would like to ensure that you're talking to them in as a gentle way as possible so that they can receive the teachings, because it's really challenging for the unenlightened mind to look at itself and realize that it's made decisions in an unwise way. So a wise teacher would have a way of gently talking with their students and helping them to be able to see what areas of improvement to make, and then making that improvement, that's where the student will see all kinds of results in their life. Things will only get better, not worse. So let me know what questions you guys have here. Okay, I don't see any questions here. All right, so I'm going to move on to the next chapter, which is chapter 38. This one is titled The Introduction of something here. I can't pronounce this word. Jahaka? I'm not sure. Okay, so we'll read this and then I'll explain to you what it is. It's actually teaching about how Brahman came to be in the world. Then some of these beings thought, evil things have appeared among beings, such as taking what is not giving, condemning, lying, punishment, and banishment. We ought to put aside evil and unwholesome things. And they did so. They put aside evil and unwholesome things is the meaning of Brahman, which is the first regular title to be introduced for such people. They made leaf huts in forest places and meditated in them. With the smoking fire gone out, the pestle cast aside, gathering alms food for their evening and morning meals, they went away to a village, town, or royal city to seek their food, and then they returned to their leaf huts to meditate. People saw this and noted how they meditated. They meditated is the meaning of Jakaya, which is the second regular title to be introduced. However, some of those beings, not being able to meditate in leaf huts, settled around towns and villages and compiled books. People saw them doing this and not meditating. Now, these do not meditate is the meaning of Ajayakaya, which is the third regular title to be introduced. At that time, it was regarded as a low designation, but now it is the higher. This, then, Vasata, is the origin of the class of Brahmins, in accordance with the ancient titles that were introduced for them. So here the Buddha is explaining how Brahman came about. We might think of a Brahmin as a Hindu priest, and during the lifetime of the Buddha, it was thought that individuals that were born into a certain family are a Brahmin. They're a holy person. It was about 15% of society, and all the other people would have to go to these Brahmin in order to pay them to do rites and rituals and ceremonies and worship. And it was thought that these people being born into this family were holy, and you wouldn't be able to improve your life by yourself, that you needed to go pay them in order to do these rites, rituals, ceremonies, and worship for you, and then your life was going to become better. Well, the Buddha knew that this wasn't true, because you're not a holy person, you're not a purified person through what family you're born into. You're holy or purified through your actions, through the wisdom that you have in your mind, and you're either verbal actions, your bodily actions, or your mental actions. That's what's determining whether or not you're holy or wholesome or have a purified mind. So here the Buddha is just giving background and guidance to understand how Brahman came about and these various titles that were applied as they were evolving and becoming individuals who were doing this in the community. Because the Buddha's teachings were, in a lot of cases, just the opposite of the Brahmin. In some cases, there were some similarities, but the Brahmin would oftentimes come to the Buddha in order to learn and practice and understand his teachings. And then they would help that individual, and they would help the individuals who are coming to talk with the Brahmin. So the Brahmin existed during the lifetime of the Buddha, and they exist nowadays too. You can see these in different places in the world, but it's through learning and cultivating wisdom that's going to lead to your enlightenment. It's not rites and rituals and ceremonies and worship that's going to lead to that. But unfortunately, there's people in the world that believe those kinds of things, and they're going to experience the results of having done those things, that they'll see that their life won't actually improve. The condition of their mind won't improve. It's through cultivating the mind and gaining wisdom that will actually lead to improvement in a better and better condition of the mind and your life as well. So let me know what questions you guys have here on this chapter where the Buddha is introducing Brahman and kind of explaining where their title came from. Okay, I'm not seeing any questions here. So now we'll go to chapter 39. This one is titled Reciting the Teachings, the Basis for Liberation. Again, neither the teacher nor a fellow monk in the position of a teacher teaches the teachings to a monk, nor does he himself teach the teachings to others in detail as he has heard them and learned them, but he recites the teachings in detail as he has heard them and learned them. In whatever way the monk recites the teachings in detail as he has heard them and learned them, in just that way, in relation to the teachings, he experiences inspiration in the meaning, inspiration in the teachings. As he does so, joy arises in him. When he is joyful, joy arises. For one with a joyous mind, the body becomes tranquil. One tranquil in body feels calm. For one feeling calm, the mind becomes concentrated. This is the third basis of liberation, by means of which, if a monk resides motivated, dedicated, and determined, his unliberated mind is liberated. His undestroyed taints are completely destroyed, and he reaches the as yet unreached, unsurpassed security from bondage or enlightenment. This is taken from the 5 bases of liberation. So what the Buddha is saying here is that during his lifetime, it was highly important to recite the teachings. A teacher who was teaching during the lifetime of the Buddha, they wouldn't really be using their own words to be able to explain the teachings, only to expound upon them and clarify them. But in order to explain the teachings, they would recite them word for word in the way that the Buddha taught them. This is how they committed the teachings to memory, and they were ultimately able to write them down after the death of the Buddha and capture them in the way that they were, is because they were able to listen to the Buddha, recite the teachings, then they themselves would recite them through chanting. This is how chanting came about, that every 2 weeks they would recite the Buddha's teachings over and over and over, committing them to memory. So what the Buddha is saying is that if you're going to teach his teachings during his lifetime and then afterwards, to recite them word for word. But you'll see in other places where the Buddha talks about a teacher expounding upon his teachings, that you would need to be able to expound upon them, elaborate on them. You wouldn't be able to help others get to enlightenment if all you knew was the discourses themselves. You would need to expound upon them. So having heard the teachings and understanding them and practicing them, this is where the Buddha says, okay, joy arises in the mind. And then when the mind is joyful, you'll notice that the body is tranquil. You won't have all these miscellaneous aches and pains and difficulties, because when you're carrying around craving and you're carrying around all these other pollutions in the mind, you're going to have all these problematic situations in the body, because the mind is the boss, the body is the employee. If the mind is polluted, it's going to affect the body, because like when you have stress and anxiety, for example, you'll feel tension across your shoulders and in your neck. When you're having anxiety, you might have this apprehension in your chest, almost hyperventilating perhaps, right? If you have a panic attack or something, this is all coming from the mind itself. So when the mind is joyous, then the body's tranquil, right? When the body's tranquil, the mind is calm. And when the mind is calm, then one has concentration. I usually teach it in this way, and the Buddha teaches it this way too. He says, and I share that when the mind is calm, then you have mindfulness or awareness of mind. When you have awareness of mind, you have concentration. When you have concentration, you can access your wisdom. So this is why you're so interested in maintaining your calmness and composure. Whenever you are in a difficult situation or a particular craving has been triggered, you like to cut that off and let it go. Maintain your calmness and composure. Because when you allow the mind to be shaken up, the mind is uncalm. Now you're lacking mindfulness or awareness of mind. Then you're going to lack concentration. And now you're going to lack the ability to access your wisdom, and you're going to make unwise decisions related to your intentions, your speech, and your actions. And now when you put out those unwise decisions, that's going to produce unwholesome results, and that unwholesome karma is going to come back to you. In order to get to enlightenment, you need to fully transform your mind where you're making wise decision after wise decision after wise decision, realizing that you're going to make missteps and mistakes and have faults along the way, but you learn from those as you're making your way to enlightenment. But the best way to ensure that you can get to this wisdom is to maintain your calmness so you can have mindfulness, concentration, and then you can access your wisdom. And that's essentially what the Buddha is summarizing here, but he says it in very direct and clear terms in the way that I'm talking about it in other discourses. But here he's relating it to the body and helping you to understand that when the mind is peaceful and tranquil, the body is going to also be peaceful and tranquil as well. And he says that in other discourses as well, that when the mind's tranquil, the body's going to be tranquil. And then this is what leads to liberation and destroying the fetters in the mind, is that by hearing the true teachings, by understanding the true teachings, that's what's going to help you get to liberation and the destruction of the 10 fetters. So let me know what questions you guys have here, because while chanting and reciting the teachings was very important and required during the lifetime of the Buddha in order to get to enlightenment, it's not required now, but you are going to need to have access to the teachings. And that's why you have this whole book series available to you at no cost, either by downloading it from our website, by taking it and go printing it, by ordering it on Amazon if you have access to Amazon, or getting versions here at the temple. You can get easy access to all the original words of the Buddha, the true teachings, and that's where you can actually get to liberation. And that's what you need nowadays, where during the lifetime of the Buddha, you needed to recite the teachings. You needed to be in the Buddha's presence or hear somebody recite the teachings that had learned directly from the Buddha. Nowadays, what you need is you need these books and resources and classes and a teacher to be able to access the true teachings of the Buddha. So let me know what questions you guys have here on chapter 39. Okay, I'm not seeing any questions anywhere. So let's go to our very last, by the way, here in this chapter, this is where I have it documented for you to be able to see what it is that I just shared with you. Okay, so our last chapter, chapter 40, this is moving into misunderstandings. There's going to be multiple misunderstandings here that are going to be shared, that this is where people are misunderstanding certain aspects of the teachings of the Buddha, because this particular book, Volume 12, Lowly Arts, it's really geared towards ordained practitioners, but there's plenty that a household practitioner can glean from this book as well. So here, this book being geared toward ordained practitioners is really helping to understand the misunderstandings related to the teachings of the Buddha. And there's multiple here, but we're just going to cover chapter 40, but then you're going to see next week that there's a bunch more here as well. And what this book does is it explains what the misunderstanding is, and it shows you the resources of how to be able to independently verify that for yourself. So this particular chapter is here explaining the misunderstanding regarding the benefits of creating a Buddha statue or a Buddha image, because oftentimes people think that creating a Buddha statue, that the spirit of the Buddha is in there, that you need to pray to this statue, you need to feed this statue, you need to treat this statue as if it's the Buddha actually sitting there. But the Buddha actually never taught that. He never taught anybody to create images or statues of him. So what this chapter is going to do is it's going to explain the sourcing of where that myth and that misunderstanding comes from, so that you'll understand where this is coming from and how it's untrue and it's actually a misunderstanding. So this is actually the words of somebody today. So it doesn't read through the words of the Buddha. It reads in the way that we would describe things now. So I'll just read this to you. The benefits of creating Buddha images can be found in this particular book, and this is part of the Pali Canon. which shares the creation of the Buddha image from sandalwood by King Pasenadi of Kosala, that once upon a time the perfectly enlightened one journeyed from Savatthi to a distant place to share the teachings. At that time, King Pasenadi of Kosala, surrounded by a great number of people, went to the great monastery in Jetavana. Not seeing the perfectly enlightened one, the king was filled with disappointment, and saying, "This world without the perfectly enlightened one is without a refuge and without a protector." Once he returned home, he thought of making an image of the Buddha. When the Buddha returned to Jetavana, having worshipped the master, the king asked the Buddha if he will allow an image of himself to be made, and the Buddha gave permission to the king. Now remember, this is a myth, this is a story, and this is where people are thinking that the Buddha actually did describe to make images of him, but he actually didn't. Okay? This is just a false story, which you're going to hear about here in a moment. When the Buddha image was completed, he invited the Buddha to see the image and asked what would be the benefits of creating a Buddha image. The Buddha then told the benefits that whoever creates a Buddha image, whether a man or a woman, whether made of clay or of rocks, made of metal or copper, made of wood or zinc, made of precious stone or silver or gold, they produce great merit. As long as there is a Buddha image, this world will not be empty. The Buddha image helps prolong the teachings and practices. Okay, so you know right there that it's false, because a statue, something external, doesn't actually prolong the teachings. It's having the wisdom in the mind. That's what prolongs the teachings. Those who build Buddha image will encounter happiness, and all their wishes will be granted. There again, you understand that this is a false story, because the Buddha never taught that there are wishes that are going to be granted. This isn't the cause and effect of the natural law of karma. The Buddha, while still unawakened, not yet fully enlightened, repaired the broken finger of a Buddha image. The benefits he gained were achieving a heavenly rebirth, and passing away from the heavenly realm entered into a powerful kingship. He was able to defeat an army merely by lifting and bending his finger. Then the Buddha narrated an incident from one of his previous lives as King Vataguli, who was able to defeat an army merely by lifting and bending his finger. Out of 50 tales in the Pasana Javata, this particular book, is the 20th Jataka. This is where it explains the life story of the Buddha. However, the period, the composer, and the place of the composition is still unclear. Some of the accepted evidence has now become uncertain because new contradicted evidence has been found. The accepted opinion is composed by this prince who existed in the preface of this first publication. This book consists of 50 ancient tales told in Thailand. A monk from Chiang Mai compiled and composed the tales in Magahi. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly, but this is the language that the teachings of the Buddha were in through Sri Lanka. So these tales that were composed by this monk in Chiang Mai around 1457 to 1657. During that 200-year time frame, this monk must have lived and composed these tales. This was about 500 years ago, which was the period when monks in this country studied from Sri Lanka and were influenced by this language of Sri Lanka. They published books in this language in their hometown by explaining and elaborating the teachings, like the monks in Sri Lanka. So this prince also spoke about this particular book. Originally, the book comprised of 50 palm leaf manuscripts tied together. Today, can only be seen in Siam, meaning Thailand, Luang Prabang, this is Laos, and Cambodia. Luang Prabang is a place in Laos. Other than that, they cannot be found. So there's these only 3 places that this particular book can be found. It has been told that the book was once found in Burma. They called it Chiangmai Panasa. However, one of the kings in Burma said that the book is counterfeited words of the Buddha and ordered for them to be burned. Thus, this book can no longer be found in Burma. The tales in this book are well known in Thailand. For example, and then they give this example of this particular tale, and that's kind of it. So here, these are the references for this particular chapter, that basically what this chapter is concluding and helping you to be able to understand is that this story of the Buddha having said to make Buddha images of him is false. And anybody who understands the teachings of the Buddha would know that's the case just by reading it. As I was mentioning, that where it talks about your wishes will be granted, that the teachings are going to continue in the world based on creating statues and things like this. This is completely opposite of what the Buddha would have taught. And if you understand the natural law of karma and what the Buddha taught, then you would understand why. But if you're having difficulties understanding that, let me know and I will expound upon it and help you to understand it further. So you can put any questions you have into Facebook, YouTube, or Zoom, or you can raise your hand in Zoom and ask any questions that you like. Okay. So I'm not seeing any questions anywhere. So what I'll do is just end class the way I typically do, which is thank you for joining and to dedicate your time, effort, energy to learn and practice the teachings, because this is going to help you, those close to you, and all of humanity to be able to grow and develop and be able to bring the teachings into the world in such a way that countless people can get to enlightenment and we can restore the teachings of the Buddha back into the world. Next week, we're going to be in the next 10 chapters, which is chapters 41 through 50. This is going to be in volume 12. And you're always welcome to study those either before or after class, because then you'll get much more benefit out of the class itself. But if for some reason you're not able to study before or after class, you can still come to class and study here. You'll get whatever you get, but you'll get so much more if you study these on your own in the books before and after class. Tomorrow in the group learning program, we're going to be in chapter 2 of volume 1, because we just started this program about 4 or 5 weeks ago, maybe 6 weeks ago, where we're now going to be in chapter 2, because each Sunday I go chapter by chapter in this book, Developing a Life Practice, The Path That Leads to Enlightenment. This chapter is titled, Why Study the Teachings of the Buddha? So I'm going to be helping you to talk about this amongst the community so that we can have a nice discussion, get to know each other, and discuss this particular topic. If you read what I wrote in volume 1, chapter 2, you'll know what I share as the reasons why it would be wise to study the teachings of the Buddha. But tomorrow's class is going to be about us having a discussion, getting to know each other, and being able to discuss this as a group so that people can get to know you a bit and I can get to know you as well. And then on Wednesday, we're going to be in the third part of a 4-part series where I'm going to be teaching loving kindness meditation. I'm going to be guiding you in a loving kindness meditation session, reminding you of a few things related to that, and then opening up to any and all questions that you have. So you're always welcome to join any and all of these classes that you like. And then coming up about a week and a half, we've got a Foundation in the Path to Enlightenment course. We have an Introduction to the Path to Enlightenment course and other things like this for you to be able to learn as well. So thank you all for joining. Perhaps we'll see you guys in a future class. Have a very lovely and wonderful rest of your day. Sawadee ka.
Thank you for listening to this podcast. To provide support for this podcast, visit patreon.com/support Buddha. To access more teachings, visit buddhadailywisdom.com. There, you will discover a full range of courses, retreats, and online resources to assist you on the path to enlightenment. Remember to establish a daily, consistent meditation practice, along with learning and practicing these teachings. A well-developed meditation practice is the foundation in which to train the mind to attain enlightenment.